All right, we are live. Thank you very much for joining me today, Brian. So if you're listening, the audience today is going to be a different episode to one that we've done before, where we've talked all about kind of performance and fucking building muscle and all that kind of stuff. Whereas we're going to go a little bit deeper into the psychological side of things today. Brian has recently finished a master's in psychotherapy and counselling, and his dissertation has been in binge eating disorder in gym goers or male gym goers in Ireland, which is, as a coach, you see on consultation forms, people who are not sure if they have an eating disorder, but they definitely, like mentioned, they maybe have like binge episodes, and there's distinctions to those. Brian, thank you very much for joining me. And I guess like the first question for you here is, what was like the motivator to get into studying this topic?
Thanks for having me, Shane. It's my first time speaking publicly about the research that I did and the results and everything else. Written for the most part up until this point. So the motivation, I suppose, like I've been, I was doing nutrition coaching for a long time, as you well know, and in that process, would work with people who had, say, disordered eating and struggling with that kind of stuff. And the more I came across that, the more I enjoyed working on that. Found it very rewarding and fulfilling to help people overcome those issues, but also the challenge in terms of it pushes you to to learn more. And I always talk to people about this, and younger coaches in the industry. It's like your first time coming across something will push you to go and try and learn more about it so you can help that person better. So there's that kind of process. But yeah, I just liked the process of helping people with their relation with food and disordered eating. And most, like, the best sort of treatments for that is going to be psychotherapy and specifically cognitive behavior therapy, which is what I got trained in as a priority. So it's just a case of wanting to help people more and better in that space, and then that would also facilitate me being able to work with people with clinical level eating disorders, whereas it would have been out of my scope of practice prior to that. I definitely wouldn't have been working with somebody a few years ago who was anorexic or something like that, whereas now I can. So that was part of the motivation, just to be better at helping people with those kind of issues. And yourself, it's always important and enjoyable to keep learning and pushing yourself and that sort of thing. So yeah, that was the motivation.
Yeah, I think it's obviously upskilling, as you mentioned there towards the end, is a very important part of the coaching role, because there's only so much you can know, and even just revisiting topics over time. Like, because I know, like for anybody on the audience who doesn't know, Brian was my first ever coach, and he worked with me for nutrition. Thankfully, I didn't like have any kind of like disordered eating patterns or anything like that, but I wanted to learn from Brian because I knew that he was extremely good at what he did. He's a coach I look up to, and he's always one that was educating himself as well. And that's kind of something I like to try to emulate as well. And I guess, like, I got to take you back here, but like, say for example, when you had your first client that was working with you and they were struggling with their relationship with food, or they're maybe kind of hinting that they might be suffering with some binge eating, how has your approach changed from then to now?
That's a good question. I suppose, yeah, it's at that point you don't know what you don't know in ways. It depends where you're going to start. Like, do you even know what binge eating is at that point? Do you then have to go explore how it's generally treated, or what the risk factors or driving forces are behind that? And I've always been interested in sort of cognitive therapies, like Stoic philosophy, that sort of informs the basis for a lot of it, because it's sort of trying to not have your thought processes overly influential, and a lot of the CBT process is about trying to, like, unpack that so you're not in a state of unhelpful thinking that's then influencing how you feel or how you behave. So I say that because it's often people, like, it's easier to say it now and like reflection because I know more, but trying to put myself back into that situation. So it's like, why does somebody struggle with eating too much in these types of binges? What are the triggers for that? So it's always going to be, and this is just basic sort of coaching skills. It's always going to be having a conversation about what's going on with the person. So just having a dialogue about that, you get a lot from that, even if you aren't super up to speed on what you're doing in terms of how to deal with this. At least you can gather some information and then start to figure out a plan. Or, if it's like outside your remit, then prepare to try and refer elsewhere. But that would have prompted me, to at least go and explore how is that treated. And some of the sort of CBT for something like binge eating is sort of basic stuff that we might say as, nutrition coaches. It's like, some of it is about regular meal times. For example, not like starving yourself all day and then ended up binging in the evening. Like that's one sort of expression of binge eating. So yeah, I suppose I wouldn't have had as much of a grasp of the sort of emotional components of it and back then, and probably wouldn't have been as well. No, I couldn't have been up to the same speed in terms of personality traits or different factors that would contribute to someone falling into this. So like, I can imagine that if someone sees that their weight had increased given day or week or something, and part of their goals were weight loss, and they had a strong emotional reaction to that, and maybe that pushed them to binge eating. Like back then, I was probably having the conversation of like, well, what does the weight mean, and trying to like educate them about that, and try to change their thinking around it. Whereas now there's a lot more that I could do to it, because it's like, all right, well, are they experiencing a lot of self-criticism or shame? Where is that coming from? Is that getting in the way of them doing the things that they need to do? So, because like when you, at least when I boil down, say the goal of something like CBT or different third wave CBT therapies, it's like the intention is that whatever is getting in the way of you achieve or pursuing your goals is the target for therapeutic intervention. So it's sort of straightforward in that sense, and something that'd be quite familiar to us as coaches. But then the tool set, I suppose, is just is different, more advanced, and more expanded than what you would do with coaching. But I've said this throughout the masters, like there's a huge amount of overlap between, say, good coaching and therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's an overlap, and then there's bits that are not, and they're separate. But there is a huge amount of overlap, especially in say CBT therapy versus, because there's so many types of therapies. Some of them less evidence based than others. In terms of evidence based therapy, there's a lot of overlap with what you and I would class as good coaching skills, right?
Yeah, like before Christmas last Christmas, I was actually doing therapy for a couple of months, just for some mindset deficits I'd say I have about myself. And one thing is like kind of like hoping on the side to get out of it was like seeing how somebody who's actually qualified at that specific skill and how they went about like questioning me and like conducting the session. Because like one thing you were talking about there is like the communication to the client that's like having this issue, and you're asking them questions, but you're kind of you give them space to answer, right? You don't just like, if there's like an awkward silence, you don't just jump in and kind of give your assumption, which is, or they don't just say the problem and then you say, okay, well, what you need to do is this. And like that's a very common thing in coaching, like on consultation calls, like your like business mentors will say you want to solve that person's problem, so like as quickly as possible, so that they see the value and kind of sign up with you. But like so much of the issues that people present themselves with in consultation calls, or like in the context of clients like that you be working with who deal with like relationship with food issues, binge eating issues, it's not like they don't know what to do. It's that they, for themselves, they don't know how to like verbalize it to themselves. They don't know like what their interpretation of kind of dealing with the issue is, and what seems to be almost like the lowest hanging fruit way for them to tackle it. And while we can come in with this like high level answer and say, this is exactly what you want to do, and boom, problem gone, it might not fit in with that person's abilities, their competency. They might not feel like they've like autonomy over like making that decision, so they're less likely to kind of engage with it. And again, so much of that just comes down to having those communication skills and be able to understand what like that looks like from a coach's perspective, which I think is challenging, because it's something that you only really develop the longer you coach people. I think early on you are very eager to show expertise and show that you are like the problem solver. But so much of, as you get older, you find that it's so much more valuable just to like listen to the client and kind of see where the input is. Because like, I guess what we're talking about here is it's completely different to speaking to an athlete who just wants to improve their performance. that can be a simple, like, math equation where you just say, okay, we're just gonna add this here, and boom, that equals the result. Whereas like the mind is like, it's like complex algebra versus anything else.
Yeah. And yeah, no, that speaks to a lot of important points. And what I mean, it reminds me now, because if you're a client-centered coach and you're trying to be with your client in those conversations as opposed to a fixer, that is one of like the fundamental aspects of, say, doing therapy, is it's going to be person-centered. Coaching is going to be a bit more directive than, and in terms of like you leading things a bit more potentially, but then also CBT is as a therapy a bit more directive than, say, a pure person-centered therapy where it really is just 50 minutes of me reflecting back to you, kind of what you're saying to me. There's a bit more structure to CBT, and it's more goals oriented. So again, that's why you see so much overlap. But yeah, I think good coaching is always going to be person-centered, as opposed to do what you're told because I'm the coach and I said so. And then even on the point with athletes, it's yeah, I mean, you're going to get that, and then at the same time, disordered eating in athletes is way higher than in the general population,
Mm.
and all the different aspects that go into that. So you always have to think treat people like people first, and then whatever else they're trying to do second. But then you could have athletes. I mean, look, class yourself in that. You were very much just able to follow the plan, and you are very much able to follow the plan. So yeah, it's just like, what do I need to do, and I can get it done. But not everyone is going to be wired that way.
Oh, for sure, yeah. I guess like where it's coming from with that was more so like I feel with, so most of the time when you work with athletes, you can spend like most of your time on this side of the pyramid that's like above adherence, because you don't have to worry about them kind of showing it to the gym or kind of like a lot of the X's and O's. Where I feel like a lot of other people who aren't not at that like level of like commitment towards that kind of single goal, you spend a lot more time working on the adherence side of things. And I feel like, I don't know, just from my experience, I feel like this is the kind of area where people get stuck in their mindset too much. It's whether it's a case of they don't understand why they're doing things, whether we're like, what's the point of me following the nutrition plan? Do I really want to lose 5 kilos? What does that 5 kilos mean? Like, I guess there could be superficial reason. They might say they're doing something for a superficial reason, but it's actually a deeper reason that they just haven't really uncovered. Like, they kind of key to unlocking maybe where adherence is. But anyway, I think I'm going a little bit off track from the topic of conversation. So I guess like what I want to, one of the big questions I want to get at right now is, when we're defining something like an eating disorder, what's the criteria for that? And like, even if you have like some kind of definitions from binge eating disorder to, kind of other disorders like anorexia, bulimia, whatever like that, if you kind of give us some kind of like rundown on that.
Yeah, sure. So you can view all these on a spectrum. I've done presentations on this where have a spectrum, and one side is normal eating, and at the other end is an eating disorder, and then somewhere over towards that eating disorder side, but not quite manifested in the clinical diagnostic criteria, is disordered eating. So disordered eating is a bit less clearly defined, and then the eating disorders themselves, of which there are several, but the main ones would be the main ones that people may be familiar with would be things like anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder. There is also ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is a bit different because it's not like influenced by, say, someone's self-esteem and sense of self and how much they value appearance and that sort of stuff. And then there are a few others as well. But if we stick with the sort of 3 that people would be maybe more familiar with, yeah, I mean, there are just like the kind of diagnostic thresholds for, say, frequency of behavior in the case of, say, binge eating and bulimia. So if we take those 2 together for a second, bulimia has binge eating in it. And then it's just also contrasted with some sort of purging behavior, whether it's induced vomiting or use of laxatives or compensatory exercise to, to make up for the binges, basically. So in terms of that, like the binges are, at least once a week for at least 3 months, and then also the same sort of frequency of some sort of purging behavior. And then in terms of binge eating disorder, it's essentially the same behaviors, but without the compensation and the purging, right? So it's the same frequency of binge eating, and we've defined binge eating as episodes of eating, in most cases, a large amount of food in a short space of time. There's usually a sense of a loss of control during that eating episode. And I say most of the time it's a large amount of food because you can have subjective and objective binges. So objective binging is more typical, and then subjective binging is, it may not be a large amount of food necessarily. Like if you ask 10 people in the street, like, oh, was that a lot of food?
Yeah.
They wouldn't necessarily all say yes, but you get the same sense of loss of control. And then the second layer to this is some of the, say, other consequences of like the emotional aspect of like feeling really shit about the fact that you did that, disgusted, depressed, guilty. Other elements of it can be, eating these large amounts of foods when you're not hungry, feeling uncomfortably full afterwards, eating very quickly. Oftentimes there's like a secret element to this where people are doing this alone or in private because of the shame involved. And then basically the eating episodes are quite distressing. So that's what a binge is in clinical terms. And then for binge eating disorder to have that, it's this idea of, okay, I do that at least once a week for at least the previous 3 months. And then you would qualify for a binge eating disorder. Now, and there's different sort of levels of severity for how frequent someone is doing that, say, in a week or in a day. And then if you're outside of those like frequencies, so say if you were binging every 2 weeks instead, it's like you wouldn't fall into that category, but then you're probably in the category of like some sort of subclinical binge eating, which is, not as clearly defined. But, like I actually have an example. Someone signed up with me this week, and he was filling in one of my questionnaires to talk about his relationship with food and everything else. And, you're saying he hasn't been binge eating in the last few months, but it is something that was an ongoing issue. So it seems like, so how do I fill in the questionnaire? But that would be the definition for, say, binge eating. And then bulimia, like I said, is that plus the compensatory behaviors, whether it's purging or compulsive exercise. And usually within that, there's this sort of driver of appearance overvaluation, it's termed as. So essentially putting too much stock in what you look like and what your physical body looks like and your shape and size, and sort of how tied that is to your sense of self-worth and what's important and that sort of thing. And then for something like anorexia, I suppose I should say that there's kind of different subtypes of all these eating disorders as well that sort of help cater for people maybe don't fit neatly into some of these categories. So when I say anorexia is usually classed by being underweight based on BMI, that, like, for the most part that's true, but there's also a variant of if you lose a certain amount of weight in a certain amount of time, then it can also qualify even if you're not underweight by the end of it. But that's sort of getting into the weeds a little bit. But with anorexia, it's characterized by food restriction for the purposes of controlling weight and body size and being very, very, very afraid of weight gain. And that's one of the main driving factors. And then people with anorexia will be underweight based on BMI. But then there are kind of like binging subtypes of anorexia, but they differ from binging disorder because the underweight component is within that as well. Whereas in, say, bulimia and binge eating disorder, then people are generally normal weight or overweight. So anyway, I don't want to get it too like technical with it, but is that okay?
No, yeah, like I mean, like it's helpful to have definitions and for people to have an understanding of these concepts, these conditions, because like I think, like, the words can get thrown around, and like when words are repeated in context that they're not meant to be heard, they kind of lose their meaning. So just like the concept of like a binge, like somebody like, oh, like had a binge last night when they just like ordered a pizza or got a takeaway, and it's like, it's not a binge. Or like, if you have a bit of chocolate in the evening time, like you have a whole bar of chocolate and you're only meant to have like a couple of squares, it's not a binge. Realistically, like, there's probably more so a case of, first a person like losing control, they just had 2 squares and like, kind of want to have the whole bar, you know that? Fuck that. Um, whereas these things are different. Like, you know, I've had consultations with people like starting up, and they kind of mention it on their consultation form, and you know, you have to ask a few questions about it. You can't just like glance over and just say, okay, like, you know, whatever. Might just be a lack of structure. And like sometimes it can be a lack of structure, right? Sometimes it could be somebody's like under eating in the early portion of the day. Maybe they've heard breakfast is bad, shouldn't have breakfast. They're not prepared when they're coming into work. They don't have like any kind of like food to bring in. They just get something out of the vending machine or like in the deli. Then they wait until dinner time when they get home, and then they eat massive dinner. And like, because they're ravenous throughout the whole day, they maybe eat a little bit more on top of it. It's not necessarily binge. It's like for a lot of people, that context would just be they have underfueled themselves during the early portion of the day, and as a result, their body is like trying to compensate the amount of energy that they want to take in. You know, versus you have the people who, you know, they could have a press full of, you know, cookies, chocolate bars, and once they open it, they'll feel as if they just can't stop, and they'll like they won't even like notice that they've eaten as much as they had, and then, as you said, like after it, there can be the post, like, or even like during, they might be like, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I can't stop myself, and then you have like all the kind of guilt and shame that ensues, and as you said, some people can compensate through exercise. They might the next day decide they need to eat less to make up for it, or do more cardio, do more steps, and it's just a very vicious cycle to get into, and there's a big difference between that and then just like, you know, having, I don't know, an extra side at a restaurant, or, you know, getting a Domino's full meal deal versus just getting a pizza. But anyway, I guess like for our population, right, our gym goers, what seems to be the prevalence of these conditions?
Good question, because part of the reason I had several reasons for choosing that group as the one that I was going to study in that research project for my master's, because there's not a lot of data on it in general. There is data in, say, athletes, which is again not quite the same population as gym goers, but they're obviously in the same kind of territory. And you would see that especially subclinical, say, binge eating, like the rates can be quite high in athletes, for example. And when I say quite high, it could be like 20% or thereabouts. Whereas in the kind of general population, depending if you look at, say, lifetime prevalence versus what they call global point prevalence, which just means like global point prevalence is just right now how many people have binge eating disorder. And in the general population, not speaking specifically to the gym goers and including men and women, that's kind of like about 1% of the population, let's say. And then the lifetime prevalence is like, has this person ever had this issue, such as binge eating disorder? And then the numbers on that then are a little bit higher, because it's not just a snapshot. So it's more like, depending on which stats you look at, it's kind of 2-3% maybe. So we don't have like a lot of really good data for this gym going population. Again, part of the reason I wanted to study it. So I'm giving this preamble because like the findings that I had from my research were a lot higher than maybe what you would anticipate from the bit of data that you would have had going into it. So I had I can start talking about the research.
Yeah, please.
So how I conducted it was I used an online survey questionnaire, which was a eating disorder questionnaire, or one type of an eating disorder questionnaire, which I selected as being the best kind of all-rounder for what I was trying to study, while also not being like excessively long, and would give me the information that I needed. So there's a lot that went into like, okay, which one am I going to choose? So in terms of and then I had just over 200 men complete that questionnaire, which is good. And then in terms of the actual prevalence then in that population, so there was like just about 23% of those 211 guys reported some sort of binge eating, and that's binge eating without purging behavior or without, say, compensatory exercise. So it's approximately like 50 men, just under 50 men in total with some sort of binge eating. Then within that group, it was just under 10% that may fall into the category of binge eating disorder. Now, this is one of the limitations, say, of the of the research is that my questionnaire examined behaviors over the previous month. You're extrapolating to
snapshot in time,
to the 3 months, right? So if you're trying to like define binge eating disorder, it matters over a 3-month timeline. Now, I did some things in terms of how I analyze the data to like trying to account for that. So again, I don't want to be too technical, but if
go for it. Like, there's going to be people of varying levels listen to this.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, I mean, on the questionnaire, like, it was the different answers were on different sort of time scales. So it was like over the last 28 days, on how many days have you binged, let's say, but that wasn't exactly how it's phrased, but for our purposes was that. So, one was like 0 days, one was 1 to 5 days, and then one was like 6 to 12 days, and then higher frequencies after that. So, my thinking was that, well, if someone hits the 1 to 5 days, then, that wouldn't qualify for binge eating disorder, even if that was on a regular basis. But then the people who are maybe 4 days out of 28, that's once per week. If that extrapolates to month 2 and 3, then it's like, all right, they could qualify for binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But I chose not to take that into account. So when I was looking at trying to estimate actual binge eating disorder, who might fit into that category, you're never going to diagnose someone from a questionnaire anyway, right? But I took that kind of 6 to 12 days in a 28-day period and saying, okay, that's a bit more reasonable, a bit more conservative to say, all right, if that extends to month 2 and 3 as well, then maybe that's more reflective. Yeah. So, you're trying to get best estimates based on the tools that I had to work with in terms of assessing these things. So, yeah, I mean, out of that, then in terms of that's how I sort of defined it, was about 8% or about 17 men in that population that could meet the criteria for binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Based on those sort of definitions. And then the subclinical, so not quite meeting that sort of frequency, but that was basically anyone who reported, 1 to 5 days in the last month having a binge. That's how I took that. That was about 15% or 31 men in the total population. So that was what I uncovered with let's say binge eating and subclinical binge eating. And again, this is like high relative to what you would maybe expect, because like I said, in the general population, the numbers are a bit lower. Now the subclinical is a bit more in line, depending on which populations you look at, especially younger populations. But like 8%, let's say, is quite high compared to what I was saying about, like, say 1% for like generally as like everyone right now is binge eating is about like percent. So obviously 8% is way higher than that. But that's what it came back with within that sample. And I mean, look, I'm obviously as aware of anyone of the limitations of the study, so we can talk through those in more detail if you want. But I'm not screaming from the rooftops. It's nearly 10. Like, all these men have binge eating disorder, right? So, but I tell you what is a really interesting finding, which I didn't expect. So I was trying to, throughout the whole process, because I was looking at binge eating more specifically, so I was trying to exclude, say, bulimia, and trying to like delineate between the two. So therefore you had to have questions on the questionnaire about purging behavior or compensatory exercise. But the most interesting finding was that, like, just over a third of the population of that group of men reported binge eating and compensatory exercise. And it was higher than those reporting binge eating and no compensatory behaviors. So that was quite unexpected. And again, there's potential limitations on that, because then you wonder then, because that's really high, like, that's suggesting like, a third have bulimia then potentially, okay? But or not maybe clinically diagnosed, but subclinical at least, in terms of binge eating, and then doing what's defined as compensatory exercise, which is, this exercise is, it's done in a quote unquote driven or compulsive way, with the purpose of burning calories, controlling body fat levels, controlling body shape. Like that's how it's defined. That's how it was asked on the questionnaire. So it was like in the past 28 days, on how many days have you engaged in that type of exercise? And that was how it was laid out, because I was thinking about this. So I was like, the interpretation of that question is maybe quite relevant. Like, do people read that and be like, oh yeah, well, I mean, I'm exercising to burn calories and
yeah, I get you.
but then again, you have to take it with the binge eating behavior as well. So yeah, that was quite surprising, and I wasn't like really expecting to report on that necessarily, but when it's there and you have the data, it seemed like relevant to talk about, because that wouldn't have expected it. And then just to sort of round that out a bit, the amount of people binge eating alongside a purging behavior such as like induced vomiting or using laxatives was very, very low. That was like 3% of the groups. I didn't talk much about that. But yeah, I'm going to stop there for a second, because I know I've been just throwing a lot of figures in.
Yeah, it's okay. Like you're talking about what we want to talk about. I guess like what you mentioned there in regards to like people saying that they, if I'm picking up correctly, that they would exercise in response to almost kind of like trying to make up for eating behaviors. Is that kind of what I'm picking up? I can see how it could be misinterpreted, I guess. I don't know. I wonder if like I asked like 10 people on the street, like how much does your drive to want to eat more, like I say, motivate you to exercise? I know like if I don't train because I want to eat more food, but I know if I wasn't training, I wouldn't get to eat much food, and I do like to eat food. It's not a disorder or anything that I have, but like if I saw that in a questionnaire, I might be kind of staring at it for a while and be like, am I picking this up correctly? I guess like a question I have for you is like, when you're kind of collecting data, where you kind of asking people about like, okay, so like what are maybe some triggers that can like lead up to kind of binge eating episodes, or kind of things of that matter? Because I think that's probably an interesting thing for us to talk about.
So was I like surveying that?
Yeah, where you're kind of asking like behaviors that they might have around food, any kind of potential triggers, environment or otherwise, that might potentially lead to binge eating.
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't, because the nature of my research was quantitative rather than qualitative, which, I mean, you could do what you're saying in quantitative research as well, but I suppose like part of the study design is, are you going to get people to complete this questionnaire, right? So a lot of my process of designing the survey was trying to make it straightforward to complete, try to make it quick. So I again chose as short a questionnaire as I could to still gather the information that I needed, because like some of the really short questionnaires didn't ask about purging or compensator exercise. Like, well, that's no good. So no, I didn't ask that. I did. I mean, within the questionnaire, like there's good questions that get at like, okay, the loss of control around eating, the quantity of food, and then within the questionnaire, you calculate different kind of subscores based on, say, purging, or based on body dissatisfaction or binge eating. So no, I didn't get to explore that with any of the respondents, but like that, I can see how that would like maybe get people thinking, and then going through the questionnaire, thinking about the way that they might answer that. But I think that would, not that would it need to be more interview based? Probably not. No, you could probably do that pretty easily on a quantitative format. There was actually, I've said this a lot throughout the masters of like the research designs. You know that meme with the drawing of the horse, and then the left hand side, the back of the horse is really like detailed really nicely, and the right hand side is kind of like more childlike. So that's what I compared the research project to, in terms of how I started, in terms of my intentions, not how I delivered it, but my like initial research proposal. I had so many more things that I was like, oh, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to look at this, and then
I guess you end up being constrained by time and then resources, I guess, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the advice was try and keep it a bit more simple. This is your first time doing this sort of research. Some of this stuff could be saved for doctorate work if you wanted to keep looking at it, which I think was good advice because, it was difficult enough to put it all together as it was. So they're like, look, this is master's level, you're probably trying to bite off more than you can chew with what you're originally designing, because there's a lot of different angles I was going to look at, but no, I think that was definitely good advice. And I'd have so many like results and stuff to report, and there was already like a decent amount in what I came away with. So, but yeah, that's what you kind of think you can do initially. And, there's no harm in thinking bigger and then narrowing it down.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does become more simplified when it comes down to actually, getting it done.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not as easy as maybe you might be led to believe when you're like reading other people's papers and hear people talk about like their research studies all the time. But I guess like, obviously we might not be able to get much from like the paper you did in regards to like triggers for binge eating, but of course you have a wealth of experience in terms of coaching people. So, what would you say are some of the more kind of common things that you come across with people who are maybe suffering with, like, again, it could be binge eating, could be like really poor relationship with food and kind of having these kind of harder episodes?
Yeah, so I know there are kind of well established risk factors for binge eating. A lot of it is down to, and this is always the case in sort of like mental health or maybe any behaviors in general, that for various reasons you may have a certain predisposition or vulnerability to something. And if we're talking about that in terms of binge eating, because you could take two people, but if one has had a very different sort of life experience, or maybe combined with just genetics, for example, as well, because genetics are quite relevant in eating disorders, it seems, as well. They're going to have two different levels of, say, susceptibility. But in terms of what actually does contribute here, in a lot of the eating disorders, it's what I alluded to earlier, this overvaluation of body shape and size. So you often see this illustrated on like a pie chart of like things that are important to a person, and this like disproportionately huge wedge of the pie is like my body and what I look like, and my body shape. So what that leads to is this higher level of appearance investment, to say like so much of my time, energy, thoughts, etc., go into trying to control that. And people have different reasons for doing so and different beliefs for that. But that's a big driver for disordered eating, is essentially, caring too much about body shape and size, and then what that leads you to do can create like a cascade, because then, you might be more sort of vigilant in like, body checking behaviors, for example, that can then impact your thoughts and feelings about your body, and then that can influence behaviors, and then things like, you get into things like restriction and dieting as being risk factors. I mean, I think that's like straightforward enough, especially when it's like a basic, right, I'm getting ready for a show. Am I going to be more or less likely to binge in that case when I'm that restricted? And then there are certain personality types that increase someone's risk of this. So low self-esteem being one, perfectionism being one. Yeah, there's one that falls into kind of like interpersonal challenges or difficulty with emotions and tolerance of emotions in general.
Yeah.
People will have different capacities for that, whether learned or just innate. And there are others, there are other kind of risk factors, like childhood obesity, for example, is another one. Say abuse in childhood. These are there's lots of different risk factors, and within those, like a lot of them are personality based, and also kind of behaviorally, and then again the kind of big driving force for a lot of these is going to be the body shape and size overvaluation. Not always, but in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you can see how within gym goers that would be an issue, because I guess a lot like I think the older people get, the more they're like, oh, I want to do it for health, but I like a lot of people deep down they want to look better. Like, like, I don't know. It's hard to separate the one from the other, because we're so exposed to what being fit looks like, or having a good body looks like, wherever like that. Like it's all so subjective, and like, even, you know, between like different like disciplines of training that can change, right? Like, somebody who has a good body for CrossFit, it's gonna look different to somebody who has a good body for bodybuilding. And then even like, you have like the whole influencer side of things that comes into it, and like maybe people have an unrealistic or poor expectations in regards to like what they can achieve like through a couple of years of training. And I can see how that would lead to both having these kind of behaviors that are initially kind of driven towards that goal, but once, I guess, not push comes to shove, once you kind of realize how maybe unachievable that could be for you, or the fact that how long it's going to take for that to occur, it can put a big strain, because a lot of people do probably become overly restrictive early on, or do things that are completely unaligned with even like their competency of behaviors to be dealing with initially, right? From the context of like nutrition, it could just be the case of, okay, they see, I know their favorite influencer is just eating like the same 6 meals a day, so they're gonna follow 6 meals a day, and once they can't stick to it, they feel like, again, that perfectionist behavior pops up, and then they're like, okay, I can't stick to that. Oh, I saw there's a nice food challenge that I might watch on YouTube, and I wouldn't mind giving that a try, kind of things. It is all very hard to parse out, and I guess like when it does come to kind of dealing with these kind of situations with clients, for example, like how do you go about like untangling some of the kind of thought processes that might kind of relate to their body composition, how they feel about themselves, and then in consequence how they kind of view their kind of food relationship?
Yeah. Like I said, the best treatment for any of like the eating disorders and disordered eating seems to be CBT. I also wanted to add there off the back of that last segment that another, another one of the reasons that I chose that population to study is that, men are really underrepresented in eating disorder research. That was a big part of it. So I just wanted to sort of caveat that, because most of what we know, say, about something like binge eating is based on studying women and female populations. So there can be differentials, and that's when I say the maybe limitations that I came across doing that research is that many of the tools to assess disordered eating, etc., are more female oriented, whereas when we think about this, the importance of the body, and that's based on some sort of ideal, right? So the body ideal for men versus women is generally different. So men are in more of this kind of masculine body ideal, and putting the value in that in terms of being, tall and muscular and lean and that sort of thing. Where it's not quite the same for women. So that's one of the things to try and sort of differentiate. And there are kind of other screens and things that are more focused on that. But in terms of actually how to help people with this stuff, so yeah, like the cognitive behavior therapies are sort of the best way. So this explores the relationship between say events and experiences and thoughts and emotions and then behaviors, and all these things will interact with each other. It's not just like a one-way flow. These will all interact and sort of crisscross. If you imagine those things on the points of a compass, like they're all crossing over and connected to each other. My current preferred way to do this is leaning more towards an acceptance and commitment therapy approaches, which an ACT is a branch off of the CBT tree, if you want to imagine it that way. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similar principles. The roots of the tree are the same in a lot of ways, and then just the way they grow is a little bit different. So the actual applications are a little bit different, but essentially we're trying to change how we relate to the thoughts that we have and the emotions that we have in a more helpful way, so that we can still pursue our goals or still act in line with our values is what it ends up being. What would I be doing if these different issues weren't getting in my way? What does that behavior look like? That's a lot of what, say, ACT therapy is about. So like, what's important to me? How do I behave in a way that's going to lead me to a meaningful life, in spite of whatever thoughts or feelings I might come across along the way? And a lot of ACT is about developing what they call psychological flexibility, whereas, rigidity, psychological rigidity in therapy sense is often a sort of a risk factor or a negative thing to try and improve upon. And that can be, you can see that in like all or nothing thinking or having food rules, for example. Those are quite rigid. Perfectionism, there's a lot of rigidity in that, in terms of like, well, I have to be perfect or I'm not as worthy, that kind of stuff. So psychological flexibility it can be defined like obviously many ways, but one definition would be the ability to experience the thoughts, emotions, etc. that we have, even if they are uncomfortable, but accept them and still act in a way that's in line with our goals and our values. That's sort of a brief summary on it. So a lot of that therapy focuses on teaching people skills to do that, to actually hold space for difficult emotions or negative thinking that may throw them off tracks. Because if someone is like super self-critical and a lot of their thoughts and self-talk is really self-critical, then that can lead them to feeling worse, and then also not showing up in the way that they want to. So if you're going to teach people to relate to those thoughts in a more flexible way, then they can make a big change behaviorally. And often these therapies come back to behavior change as being like the main thing, and the interventions are an avenue towards that. So in terms of like CBT, like a lot of the behavioral elements of that would look familiar to us as, say, like nutrition coaches, because we're talking about trying to eat regular meals, and we're talking about not going too long between meals, and eating in a balanced way. So any sort of behaviors that you can come up with that are going to be supportive of achieving that goal are going to be worthwhile. And then, especially within eating disorders, you also got this component of body image, which is someone's perception of their body. So not necessarily what it looks like and what it is, but their own perception of that. And that's going to be influenced by their lived experience. It's going to be influenced by culture and how much they're exposed to the ideals and what you're supposed to look like, so to speak. And then there are different components of that, of like body image thoughts and feelings and behaviors, right? So you're often trying to, in the kind of eating disorder space and disordered eating, you're often trying to address that as well, because that's such a big part of it. But the tools and techniques are similar, let's say, but then you would come up with like specific behavioral interventions for that. So like, say, mirror exposure is one of the behavioral interventions for, say, reducing negative body image, where you sort of put someone in that situation where it's going to be uncomfortable and they have to see themselves, which they may not like to do, because it may be very negative when they do that. They might be super critical of themselves, where you're trying to, the goal there with that exercise is to like sort of describe yourself very objectively, from head to toe, without delving into like, well, you look disgusting, or your calves are so small, bro. So anyway, I'm going on a bit of a digression there with talking about specific exercises, but does that?
Well, that is a specific exercise area. You're saying point. I guess like one thing I want to ask you, because you kind of mentioned at the very start of it, is how much of the kind of I'd say underreporting of the prevalence of like eating disorders in males is like that, like masculine kind of, the masculine need to not kind of share our emotions or share our problems, because I think, to follow on from like the kind of the male ideal physique, whatever like that, there's also like the false male ideal like mentality of like, you're the fucking alpha male, tough guy, doesn't show emotion, like, and like, there's no such thing as like not, as I say, it's just over indexing on like just discipline is the only thing that matters. Like, it's like fuck your feelings, just kind of do it regardless kind of thing. Like how much do you think is related to that? Because I think, when people are maybe, when guys especially open up, they're always at fear of like ridicule, of like being like labeled as weak or like a pussy or something like that by friends or other people. Do you think that plays a kind of big role in this?
Yeah, definitely. Like, and you see that, pretty clearly in some of the, say, the qualitative research of, men's experience in seeking help with, say, whether it's eating disorders or mental health more broadly, but you see all these sort of stereotypes come into it, right? That eating disorders are generally seen as like a feminine thing. So right away, and it's like, why is that the case? So, that's where it can start. And it's like, well, if I'm a guy, then like you're saying, it's not masculine to have like problems with your eating, for example. And it's generally, it's more likely to be missed in practice as well. That like, if someone goes to their GP and says, I have these eating problems, like there's a higher likelihood that it won't be picked up than like if it was a woman going to do that. So yeah, it's a kind of portrayal of it being a feminine issue, and I wrote a lot about that in the dissertation itself, sort of how we need to sort of take into account this sort of the masculine aspects of this, because it is a limiting factor for sure in terms of people reporting on this stuff. And part of the reason I wanted my questionnaire to be completely anonymous is so that guys wouldn't shy away from potentially filling it out, because there's no way to trace back any of the responses to anybody that completed it. No, it's super relevant. And then it's an interesting, but it comes back to a cluster of beliefs, doesn't it, in terms of like, well, if I'm a man, this is how I'm supposed to show up and go about my business. But then I think it always comes back to like, all right, well, how's that working for you? Like, what, like, are you sort of getting what you want in that sense? And there's this concept in ACT therapy of creative hopelessness. So it's like, well, this stuff, what have you tried up until now? All right, how has it worked for you or not? And if it hasn't worked so well, maybe we try something different in terms of trying to help people achieve their goals, whatever they may be. But yeah, I mean, it's no good. Like if you're saying, well, I'm supposed to be a big alpha chad male, but I'm still binge eating and still picking my body apart, in the mirror, and I'm insecure about, my physique and stuff. You can say all the, I just have to be a tough guy, but what are you doing to support yourself in being happier with those things? It's a very important topic of conversation, because it's like, part of my view on it is, it takes a lot of courage and strength to actually say, well, actually, I'm struggling with this stuff. So is that masculine, to step towards that, rather than just kind of suffer on and sort of going nowhere with it. And, and then it's a question of like, how does that help you show up for other people in your life, and so on and so forth. But anyway, it's an important topic of conversation, though. And it does play a big role on, reporting of help seeking and reporting of issues. And actually, that was, I say, that was one of the things I was, in the early days of planning the research, I was going to explore more about help seeking behaviors for men in eating disorders specifically, because it is sort of underrepresented. Because I think the research points to something like binge eating being, fairly equal across men and women, whereas anorexia and bulimia do bias towards being more female dominant. But then, I've worked with guys who have anorexia, and it's only a relatively small sample of people that I work with, based on just pure numbers. So there are people who struggle with this stuff. But anyway, going tangential again.
All good. We're here for the tangents. Yeah, I guess, look, I can understand why. I can kind of understand why guys may think that it was like, it's always been like a kind of female thing to have like eating disorders and issues with food, because I think females have been definitely stigmatized longer for like how they look than guys have been. I think it's only maybe like the last like 2 decades where people have been more like, where guys have been more aware of like how they look because of social media. Like before then, like it didn't matter. Like it still doesn't really matter what you look like, but it was like in like the public consciousness of like, this is how a man should look. There's like none of that. Like, you obviously had like your movie stars, but like movie stars are movie stars. Whereas like now you open up your phone and like everybody, like they're like, not everybody, but like a large, you can see like a lot of people have like movie star physiques, and like why do I not look like that? And of course then as well, access to lots of different nutritional information, and nutrition is one of those things where everybody eats, everybody has an opinion, everybody has a way of kind of doing things for them, and there's a lot of very poor advice as well on nutrition that like people can easily follow, like uber restricted diets or just unhelpful ways of framing nutrition. And the more of these you go through and you have like failures with it, the more it like erodes at like your confidence, your self-efficacy, and this can potentially kind of like cause these kind of issues to maybe become more prevalent because you feel like I've tried all these different things to try to influence how my body looks. I haven't got the results that I want, and because I've tried all these things and I've failed, anytime I feel like I am going to try something new again, I'm probably going to reach that point anyway where I fail, relapse, and kind of go through this like continuous cycle of things.
And it reminded me of something else I wanted to touch on myself, that part of the research that I did was looking at, I did some sort of took BMI into account for some of the things that I was looking at, right? So in terms of binge eating behavior, that wasn't surprising in terms of what came back there, that overweight or obese men were experiencing higher rates of binge eating. That's fairly clear in research already, so that was as expected. But I also looked at levels of body dissatisfaction in normal BMI. I looked at body dissatisfaction across the different BMI categories. Just in terms of what we're speaking about now, it was it was like nearly 30% of the normal BMI men in the group reported what I calculated as high levels of body dissatisfaction. So that is maybe interesting in terms of what we're talking about here. Again, and we're both familiar with the limitations of BMI as a gauge, especially in maybe that kind of population of people who are going to the gym, and which was defined as, just to put that in there as well, going to the gym on average twice a week. That was what I took as my criteria for that, to make you gym go. But yeah, about nearly 30% of men in the normal BMI group reporting what I calculated as high levels of body dissatisfaction.
That is quite high. And I guess I think for a lot of people who do start off in the gym, I think it's okay to maybe initially start off with the goal of I want to kind of change how my body looks and its appearance. But I think there's a point at which you should get to, it could be 6 months, a year into the process, where you notice enough kind of physical change if you've been doing things relatively correctly, that there should be a little bit more, there should be a reflective process of being able to acknowledge the work you've done. For me, this is where I've always found me take my progress pictures to be my my little kind of checkpoint, to just have that piece of evidence, and then contrast that with pictures over time. Because I feel like sometimes if people don't have some type of self-monitoring process that actually kind of allows them to objectify the kind of changes they've made, it can be harder to acknowledge the work you've been putting in. Because yourself, you don't really kind of see the kind of results. You don't see your results unless you're kind of comparing and contrasting, because you see yourself in the mirror every single day. Even when I look at my arms or look at my legs, in person like this, they look like they're the same size they've been for the last 10, 15 years, but they're clearly not. And yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this exact point, but I think there's probably not enough people kind of trying to allow themselves to accept the kind of rate of progress that they're making, but also being able to reflect on kind of progress that they have made so far. And I think coming back to what you're talking about, the acceptance commitment therapy, it is really important to acknowledge when you're in the gym and you're starting off, and you're looking to change your body composition, that it just takes a long period of time. And for that to be if that's the only reason to be motivated to train, it's going to be kind of a hard one for you to keep up that level of behavior. And as well, it's going to become draining from a nutritional perspective. Absolutely, right? Because I think, again, a lot of people come in with these ideas that to achieve a certain body composition, that they need to have these really rigid and inflexible standards when it comes to food. And that could be I can never have chocolate. I can't go out and order a pizza, or can't go on holidays and just kind of eat what I want. Anytime I'm kind of chatting with clients about these kind of topics, and they're going away on holiday or something, and they're kind of worried about like the impacts it's going to have on their body composition, I'll usually come at it from an approach like, if you're gonna go on a holiday and then you're never gonna go train again and you're never gonna look after your nutrition again, I'd probably like, yeah, you can have scope to be worried, but it's probably not because of the weekend. It's probably because you're just gonna stop doing all these things full stop. But like, if you're gonna go on your holiday, enjoy it how you want, and then you come back and you get back into the kind of beneficial habits and behaviors that you're not doing because you feel like you're forced to do them, but you're doing them because you like to do them. You know how to make you feel day to day, energized, good mood, feel like you like have achieved some type of success at the end of the day. If you're doing that for like years and years and years, the impacts of either those short periods of time where maybe you're less consistent or less perfect, they come out in a wash, because I know that from working with lots of people over the years, but I also know from my own experience, I've been far from perfect since the time I started going to the gym, like even this summer, like I was meant to be doing a pretty decent diet. I went on holiday to Ibiza for fucking a couple of days, and I had like multiple weddings and all that, and I wasn't being my fitness self. I was probably being the complete opposite to my fitness self at all of them. But you get back into the kind of habits and behaviors that again kind of lead you towards the path that you want to be on, and then that over time is the kind of thing that's kind of nudging you in direction. So you're accepting that like life is chaotic, life is not going to be perfect, but despite having all that kind of chaos going on, are you still on a whole going to be kind of living in accordance with like your values and like and your goals? I think that's really what it comes down to at the heart of it, for me anyway.
Yeah, it touches on a really important concept of the source of the motivation and the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. And a lot of what you're getting at there is, if you don't have a good sense of intrinsic or internal motivation, it's a lot harder to sustain for the longer term, because you're externalizing it. And I talk about this a lot in terms of like the healthy or unhealthy sources of motivation, because two people could engage in the same behavior but do it for very different reasons, and then it's not like the behavior that's you're sort of labeling as being positive or negative, but it's maybe the motivation for it. It's like going for a walk because you want to get some air and increase your activity a little bit for the day. If you've been sedentary, get a bit of time to yourself, versus, well, I need to go for this walk because I ate a little bit more earlier on and I need to make sure I don't get fat because of this. That's same behavior but two very different motivations for doing it, which is super relevant. In terms of a lot of what I talk to clients about is, because we talk a lot about kind of being driven by, say, self-criticism versus being driven by, not driven by self-compassion, but harnessing self-compassion. And people sometimes have the wrong idea about what it means to be compassionate, so we often frame it as criticism versus respect. Like, what does it look like for you to act in a way that respects yourself?
Yeah.
And try to move towards that, because I don't think it would be fair if I sat here and was berating you for 10 minutes and calling you all sorts of names under the sun and talking about your character. I don't think you would say, oh yeah, Brian respects me. So in terms of the self-talk that people have and the way they treat themselves, like, can you do what's in line with self-respect? And it's like saying you're a piece of shit and you need to get on the diet is not, I don't think, a way to show respect for anyone else, right?
Yeah, it's like for your, if you're envisioning like your future self and you're thinking about almost like my ideal future self, what kind of characteristics or behaviors or whatever like that are they doing, and like kind of how can I get there, versus like how do I need to change my shitty behaviors? So I take it's more like aspirational and kind of working towards them versus berating what you currently have and kind of putting yourself down. Is that kind of what I'm kind of picking up from that?
Yeah. It's just I often use this sort of metaphor of, if you're going on a journey, like say on a train journey, and you're sitting in the carriage and you have a choice between having like a really nice scenic train journey where it's all like mountainous and the weather's good, like you're going somewhere alpine, let's say. This is what I imagine when I'm talking about this metaphor, versus a really dark, dreary, wet, sort of miserable environment outside your train carriage. It's like going in the same direction, you're heading to the same destination anyway. And one is more in line with the sort of respect, compassion way to go down that, or way to undertake that journey, versus the more critical and shaming way to do it. And if you're saying that you're going to go either way, then why not make it a nicer journey for yourself?
Mm,
And
yeah.
if people are highly driven by criticism and shame and things like that, it tends not to last anyway. So those are poor sources of fuel for getting to where you want to get to, like beyond the short term, because end up usually pushing people to turn away from actually doing the things that they would need to do to fall under that kind of heading of respecting oneself.
Yeah, and I guess like that source of motivation is also extremely draining. Like you hear about this a lot, like in sport or something, like, or people proving the hate is wrong. You know, that kind of concept, and yeah, it might work very much like for like an immediate goal, but it certainly won't like work long term. I can imagine that type of motivation, like it might serve you well, but it probably doesn't serve people around you well because look, it kind of does kind of when you're kind of in that mind space and you're being overtly negative about yourself, people can definitely kind of see it, and it can be draining for everybody, not just yourself. As much as we all kind of need support in our goals and any endeavor that we have, and especially like if one of your current struggles is like the likes of nutrition, right? And for the person who is maybe kind of having that more kind of like maybe pessimistic or kind of bleary kind of outlook to kind of overcoming their issue, it can also come off to be like maybe kind of close off to maybe kind of getting help, and kind of seeing like if it's from a masculine perspective, like I don't need help to overcome this, I can do it by myself, and it's like you need to have both understanding of what the thing that you're dealing with is. You have to understand what are helpful and non-helpful ways to kind of go about achieving the goal, and then you also need support because like support is probably one of the foundational kind of like reasons why coaching is successful. Like athletes at the highest level have coaches like a lot of us coaches. We also have coaches or mentors, and because we simply can't get where we want to go alone, and especially when it comes down to something that's like going on in your brain that you can't even really. Again, a lot of people who maybe are having kind of issues when it does come to nutrition that are rooted in a psychological aspect, they can't really kind of verbalize it themselves. Like there's only so much so much you can describe in your brain before it's actually helpful to put down into a piece of paper, or you speak it into existence to somebody else to kind of maybe have you kind of catch or like challenge it. And I think again, I know for myself when I was doing therapy, some of the things that was going on in my head, like it's like kind of getting me down or like frustrating me or stressing me out. Then you have a therapy session and they're like, okay, like, can you explain that? Could you put a label onto that emotion? Like, how does it make you feel? Like, that kind of generic question. But then once you say it out loud to a person, you're like, okay, I can kind of start to see where I might be able to kind of come at this problem from and like address it in a more helpful way. And then of course, if you're working alongside somebody who is an expert, they can say, okay, well, like, that sounds like a great idea. Have you thought about maybe coming at it from this way? Or like, what do you think about this? And then that's like providing that, how to say, it's filling maybe a knowledge gap that you don't have or a skill gap that you don't have. Which again, as you said at the very start of the podcast, you only know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And that can be a lot of times where maybe some people are having these issues persist.
Yeah. It's you mentioned a skill gap. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I reduce a lot of the sort of therapeutic work that I do in terms of helping people develop skills to relate to the thoughts and experiences that they have in a way that doesn't drag them down, basically. And so one of the main concepts within, say, ACT is not letting thoughts get their hooks into you, and then part of the skill is developing an ability to create space between yourself and the thoughts that you have. So this is where it deviates a little bit from, say, traditional CBT, which is quite interested in the content of the thoughts and then, deconstructing them and challenging them and then that sort of thing. Whereas ACT is more about, well, they can be whatever they are, but can I detach myself from them and just do whatever I need to do anyway? And there's a metaphor that's used a lot, and I use it a lot as well, that like, if you're driving in a car on the road, which is in line with your values and it's leading you towards your goals, different destinations along that road, you might have passengers such as negative thoughts, mood, like different mood challenges, etc., in the car with you. But you don't necessarily need to wrestle with them or pull the car over and try and kick them all out of the car, because all that is time spent not driving on the road. Whereas if you just kept driving and said, okay, these passengers, I may not like them necessarily, I may not want them to be there, but can I still keep doing the things that I need to do in terms of, putting the foot down and driving it on? That's that's one of the main metaphors within, say, ACT therapy that I quite enjoy. But yeah, it's skills based in terms of how do I behave in response to the thoughts and feelings that I have, or how do I feel in relation to the thoughts that I have, and so on and so forth.
I guess like one thing I'd like to finish off the podcast with is I do find that a lot of people, they struggle a lot more with they struggle a lot more around food when they're undergoing like periods of like high stress, and like these episodes can come up a lot more. If somebody's kind of experiencing that particular problem, like what are some useful kind of tools they can use just before they maybe feel as if they're kind of going to start to, engage that behavior?
Yeah, so you see this a lot. Some of it will depend, because I know I can think of some clients like that are maybe stress eating as alongside trying to get like a lot of stuff done that they need to get done, and that's the source of their stress. So they're not like stopping to eat necessarily, they're just eating while trying to push on through. As you might expect, a lot of this is sort of being curious about how things could be. So, what would it be like if I did feel super stressed, and then what? So what's the purpose the eating serves there? Is it a soothing thing? It makes us feel a little bit better, or it helps distract us from how we, feeling the strength of those emotions, potentially, or the level of stress. But it can be a question of, what if I experienced the feelings of stress and didn't necessarily do anything with it? Like, what would that be like? And then again, within the skills based work, you're looking at, okay, if I have like cravings or urges or impulses to go and eat, then, say two of the main skills in, say, ACT therapy would be something called cognitive diffusion, which could be applied here, and also expansion work, which is more directed towards emotions or sensations, and then diffusion is more about the thoughts and the cognitions. You're looking at like, how can I, just because I have the thought, oh, I just need to eat that now, or I just need something to pick me up, or to, I'll just go and eat that, packet of biscuits, whatever those impulses are. If they have their hooks in, then they might drive you on to engage in that behavior. But if you have skills such as the ones I mentioned there, then you have a choice in the matter more so. And you can look at, of course, like relaxation techniques as well to try and manage the stress a bit more. And some of these, say the expansion exercise would be, inherently relaxing to an extent as well. But it's more about cultivating this ability to tolerate those emotions and to accept that they're there and make space for them without them having to, get their hooks in and dictate how you behave. That's a lot of the concept. So, someone's stress eating, they're probably going to have cognitions around that. They're probably going to have some sort of impulses. There's going to be some sort of sensory element to that, of like it feels a certain way. So a lot of the techniques that I would use and teach would be helping someone relate to those feelings, so they don't necessarily have to drive them towards something like stress eating if that's not considered a valuable behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like makes complete sense. So it's more so about like kind of almost trying to catch the thoughts as they come in, and essentially trying to kind of challenge them, and as I said, like trying to diffuse them from the situation. Would you ever like kind of recommend things like, you hear about people using a more kind of like meditative practices, whether that's like, a bit of deep breathing to try to calm down their nervous system if they're having like an overactive like sympathetic response. um do you kind of find any of those type of practices to be any use?
Yeah, for sure. Like, so they fall into like relaxation practices. So you can do, I deep breathing is the most common one I recommend because it's so accessible and you can almost do it anywhere. Like if I'm sitting at the desk here and I'm starting to feel super stressed, like I can do deep breathing. I don't need privacy. I don't need to stop what I'm doing necessarily either. Once I get good at it, I can just tune it in. Progressive muscle relaxation is another good one potentially. But then again, within the psychological flexibility framework and they say the ACT framework, it's can I accept that this is how I feel right now and do what serves me? Because a lot of maybe what people struggle with is like the tolerance of that sense of distress maybe, and it makes them turn away from it and try to push it away or run from it. And sorry, you mentioned there kind of there's a lot of like mindfulness practice in this because you're trying to channel sort of the observing part of your mind that sees everything that's going on. So one of the metaphors that's used is like a chessboard, and the chess pieces are the kind of different sensations, thoughts, and feelings, etc. that you're having, but you are the chessboard. So you can
Mm.
see all this happening, like the game being played, but it's not you. So you're trying to channel that, and then that expansion exercise that I mentioned is essentially a mindfulness meditation, but it's more, and it combines some breathing, but it's more of a focused way to create space and tolerance for emotions or feelings or cravings, because you do see like there is obviously research done on say ACT and helping people with cravings, helping people with things like weight loss and supporting the body image side of things as well. But yeah, it's like making space for all those experiences. Is it the kind of price of admission of
Mm.
doing the things that you need to do or doing the things that are meaningful? And yeah, this is getting very into the concepts of that particular type of therapy, but I am quite fond of it. So the answer is yes to the actual question you asked me to use those techniques.
I,
Definitely.
I I appreciate you talk through all this, because I think it's like I haven't done like too much reading into ACT. Emma has a book on it somewhere in the house, which I must actually just actually read the thing cover to cover. But I guess like, the from what I have read of like psychology kind of practices, and like kind of like things like CBT, a lot of it really is kind of rooted in trying to develop like pretty like, fucking Jedi level self awareness. And I think that's what I think as you get older, you're always trying to get to that place, because so much of our problems that we come up with on like a week to week basis or a day to day basis are almost like stuff that we manufacture in our head, or things that manufacture in our head, or outside stressors that we don't know how to fully deal with. And if we don't know how to fully deal with, again, just our core competencies are kind of like, again, because we don't know how to kind of tackle that head on, we can have these either like tendencies to like cave into ourselves, or feel like we can't even attempt to rise to the challenges. And again, I think something like the ACT therapy, where again you're accepting a lot of this stuff head on, but you're still saying, well, I can accept that maybe I'm not as skilled to kind of handle this current issue as best I can, or I don't have all the knowledge in the world available to me to kind of completely kind of erode this problem. I can still do something, and like something will be better than doing nothing at all, or kind of crumbling into myself. That's good. Like, where, yeah, that's kind of like how I've always kind of viewed a lot of this side of life, if you get me. I guess we're kind of gone off from like the binge eating kind of aspect, but I guess towards the kind of the general mindset issue.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, you reminded me of something there as well that I always say when trying to work with people on these things, that like any skill, I often use comparisons to training or exercise, right? So, you wouldn't go and try and run a marathon without having done any training for it. So in the same way, you need to practice these skills in sort of lower stakes situations so that you'll get more competent with them, like
Hmm.
any skill. You get better at it with practice. You're not going to go in and say pull 400 kilos on the bar to try and squat it because you haven't trained up to that capacity, right? And it's the same idea with some of these things, that like if you're in your kind of most stressed part of the week, like if you don't have any reps put into with those types of skills, then you're probably not going to be able to access them as much. Same way as you
Mm.
can't not get buried by a 400 kilo squat when you haven't like built the requisite strength. And how do you do that? Well, you do training sessions and you do it consistently over time. And it's the same sort of premise with these sorts of things. So that's something I always say is like, you need to keep the tools sharp, as opposed to saying when I feel super stressed and I want to binge eat, I'll tap into the diffusion or I'll do the expansion. It's like it's way less likely to happen unless you're getting reps in on a more regular basis. So that's important to keep in mind.
Mm. Yeah, that's essentially building resilience, right? Like that's the whole. If we're exposed to stress more often, we'll be better equipped to handle it time and time again. Assuming that we've done some type of work or our body's made some type of adaptation or something like that. Brian, look, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak to me on this topic. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to go over, or is there any parting words of wisdom that I'd like to leave the audience with?
We covered most of what I wanted to go through, but so I think I can point people to some resources maybe that could be
Yeah,
helpful
yeah,
based on some of what we talked about. And you said Emma has a book in around somewhere on ACT, which is probably The Happiness Trap. I have a vague recollection of talking to her about that maybe before. And that is a book I would recommend a lot. So The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. It's a really sort of easy read, but it goes through all the principles of acceptance and commitment therapy. There are other books for sure, but I think that's like the most accessible, and it's also not that long, but it covers all the main concepts. So that would be good. And then there are some good resources for a lot of workbooks out there in the therapy space of like say the body image workbook. If someone is trying to get support on body image by Thomas Cash, and there's plenty. There's like compassion focused therapy workbooks as well that help people develop these. Because some of these things, depending where someone's at, could be appropriate to try and do it with so the self-guided self-help versus seeking out additional support. But of course, if someone does want additional support, then trying to find the right person for that is good. So we're talking about getting support. I would say that earlier, like that. Say I, as a therapist, have to meet a clinical supervisor on a regular basis to get support for me in terms of my therapeutic practice. That's where I get to go and talk about what I'm doing with clients, and if I'm getting stuck, I get support on that. And even just unpacking my own relationship to doing therapy, all these things are important because at least at this level where I'm not doing it obviously that long, relatively speaking, there is always this meta component where I'm like watching myself doing therapy and thinking about how I'm doing it, and then bringing stuff into supervision to discuss based on that. So but yeah, those are some resources, and yeah, that'll do it, I think.
awesome. And where do people find you? Not a home address. You can keep that private.
Mostly on Instagram, which is at Brian O'Hengisa. I have been on a lot of podcasts. I think if you search my name, I'm sure most of those will come up. Usually talking about disordered eating and stuff like that, and these topics. And then if there's any sort of not just professionals, but like we put a lot of content out on the website. There's a whole section for coaches now that we've built out. So there's loads of content on the triagemethod.com website. But say we have some articles written on, say, cognitive diffusion, and if you're a coach and you're like, oh, that sounds good, like I wonder how I can maybe bring that into practice, even though I'm not a therapist. So we've written some stuff on that. and some other good stuff. So yeah, Instagram and triagemethod.com, I think, are the two places to go.
Are you guys going to be making not intuitive eating, but like, are you going to be going to be making a course on this type of topic?
Yes, that is the plan. It's like, of all the things that we want to do, it's like trying to decide where to slot various things in. Yeah, short answer, yes. But I can't tell you when it's going to be.
Yeah. A long list of things to do.
Also deliberating over, okay, do we do a course to help like professionals in this area and upskill, or do we make it more like for people who want to actually help themselves with this stuff? But yes, I'll be at some point putting something together in that regard in terms of helping. Yeah, probably helping both of those.
Yeah. In one way or another, it's going to help both people. All right, look, Brian, thank you very much for joining me today. At home, if you have been enjoying the podcast, please do leave us a rating and review on the podcast platform that you're listening on. Go over, give Brian a follow Triage Method, look at all their content. It is phenomenal. And yeah, look, we will catch you in the next one.